So, I mean, obviously MiFID II, MiFIR cover a lot of ground in policy terms. The likely economic impacts are equally broad-ranging. What Maria's asked me to do today is to give a sense of the overall implementation impact. And obviously I'll do that, but what I'll also do is touch upon a few of the specific policy areas, just to talk about both the system's implementation challenges, but also the potential for there to be an impact on capital market activity. So just to outline very quickly what I'm going to cover today, I will very briefly set out what kinds of economic impact I'm going to be interested in, and then I'll start focusing on some of the initiatives within both the market infrastructure piece within MiFID and also within the protection of investors piece within MiFID. Then I'll have a quick recap around who's bearing, what the, sort of the overall cost of all this is, who's most likely to be bearing the burden of that, and then I'll hand it over to the floor for any questions or observations. So, I mean, this image may give you a clue about the direction of travel that I'll be taking in terms of giving the industry's perspective. I mean, that's she's burdened by red tape. I mean, Martin, and I'm sure the other speakers who have you've been listening to over the last day and a half have given you a very good overview of the key changes coming about due to MiFID II. In terms of my sort of 30-second take on MiFID II, it's applying rules that apply to equity markets in MiFID I and broadening the scope of that to other asset classes. It's striving to future-proof regulation, particularly in terms of its coverage of trading venues and its redefinition of trading venues. And one possible consequence of that, which one of the someone touched on this morning, is that it could curtail future innovation in capital markets, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing, to be honest. It also increases the sell side's responsibilities in terms of their interaction with buyers. And just overall, MiFID II marks a very significant movement towards a single rule book in Europe. That's an important innovation. The concept of a single rule book is much favoured, particularly by bigger firms, because they are more likely to have cross-border activities. That doesn't mean that bigger firms are fans of every rule in a single rule book, but the overall concept they like. And what I should say is, I mean, in terms of the motivations of MiFID II, I mean, Martin explained how it arose from the financial crisis and the desire to promote market integrity. And that's certainly true, and the provisions of MiFID II will certainly greatly enable supervisors to see what's going on in capital markets. But also, let's not forget there is a political dimension in terms of the development of MiFID II. I mean, that process took about 4 or 5 years. And so there are certainly some elements within it which I personally would categorise as wholly political in terms of their motivation. For instance, the imposition of position limits in commodity markets. And there are also some elements which are very clearly the result of political compromise. So they've moved a long way from what the policymakers originally intended, and you end up with something which maybe works as a political compromise, but maybe doesn't work so brilliantly in terms of its potential application to markets. The example I would pick there would be the inducements rules, in fact, but we can come back to that. So very quickly, I mean, what do I mean by compliance costs? I mean, in definitional terms, these are the incremental economic costs of complying with the policy. The simple version of that, or the more straightforward to conceptualize aspect of that, is it's the cost of installing new systems, reworking business processes in order to actually just be basically compliant with the policy. And I'll talk about those. But the other side of it, which I'll also talk about, are the kind of indirect compliance costs, the wider impacts of policy. And what might that mean? It's where the actual capital markets themselves might be transformed. So in a very simple version, maybe the volume of trading in a particular market reduces maybe significantly. That would be a wider impact which would have consequences, and certainly if there's a reduction in volume, adverse consequences for the financial services industry, but also potentially for the so-called real world in terms of non-financial services firms, essentially. So just in terms of those direct costs, as I said, it's mostly about reworking business processes. Nowadays, that very much means it's a technology project, not just because it's not just to support the activities themselves, but it also underpins the reporting and monitoring. It's, everything has an IT dimension. And actually, you can see that certainly in financial centres like London, there's already competition for resources, because it's not just MiFID II, there are other measures being implemented at the same time. So compliance staff salaries, IT salaries are increasing above the rate of background earnings growth. And that acceleration is being attributed, at least in part, but quite a big part, to the implementation of MiFID II. So if you're seeing that in London, I think you're also probably seeing that in other financial centres. But it's having an impact is the point. And although so possibly a cost mitigant would be the fact that implementation is for early 2018 rather than 2 months ago or 3 months ago. And that's allowed firms to think more about outsourcing technology requirements to third-party vendors, and that will save them money. So maybe some of the original estimates of the cost of implementation are no longer valid, and maybe they're coming down for that reason. As I said, there's a contrast between these kinds of direct compliance costs and the wider indirect impacts, because MiFID II is not simply an IT project. How firms do business is also being reworked. And if you're writing rules to change behaviour, there's always going to be scope for unintended consequences. For instance, just by trying to eliminate incentives for bad behaviour, you might overshoot and actually eliminate the incentives for all kinds of behaviour. And it was mentioned that I also studied history. I mean, in this instance, there's very little that history can tell you about the expected experience with some of the measures. MiFID II breaks new ground in some areas. So, for instance, in the application of transparency requirements, particularly pre-trade transparency requirements to fixed income markets, you don't really see that anywhere else. So you have to speculate in terms of what the ultimate impact will be. Just in terms of sort of the information sources I've used for this presentation, Martin touched upon the official narrative. In terms of full disclosure, I actually worked with the Commission on analysing its the framework directive and some of its implementing measures. I think in terms of having a full version of the official narrative, you also need to look at ESMA's technical standards and how impactful they are. There you have a bit of a problem because that work was not quantified. So you have the Commission's estimates, but it only covers part of the policy piece. So inevitably, the actual cost will be a little bit higher than Martin showed. Also, when that work was done at a certain moment in time, the policies evolved quite significantly subsequent to that anyway. So just to give you to try and fill in the gaps, to give you a fuller sense of the picture, I've had a look at other consultancy reports which try to estimate or gauge just how impactful some of these measures might be. It comes up with a bigger number than Martin showed. I don't know if that's more accurate or not, to be honest. In some ways, it doesn't matter too much. Whatever the number is, it will be a relatively small proportion of the total profits of the banking sector or of the operating costs of the banking sector. That said, what's happening now is a significant part of the IT budgets, of the change budgets for the current year. So time and money being spent on implementing MiFID II is not being spent on doing anything else. So I'm going to look at a couple of aspects of the upcoming changes to market infrastructure, specifically the transparency requirements and transaction reporting. And I think I see MiFID II as representing a step change in the breadth and depth of intervention in market infrastructure, particularly in terms of the transparency requirements. So I'm going to take a step back from what's on the slides. I referenced transaction costs a number of times, and I think it might be helpful just to break down transaction costs in capital markets into a couple of components. Firstly, there's like the spread, the bid-ask spread. That's the difference between the buy and the sell price. That's a very obvious transaction cost. Another form of transaction cost, which is perhaps a little bit less obvious, but is very much impacted and interwoven with the concept of transparency, is the impact of the price of an instrument moving, changing between you saying, you thinking, I want to buy it, and you actually having bought it. And with pre-trade transparency, you announce the market sees upcoming orders. So clearly that gives people an opportunity to think about adjusting their price expectations and trading against you. That is not necessarily a problem. The motivation for transparency in lit markets is to improve and to make more rapid the price discovery process. But if you have a large order, there's scope for some short-term distortion in the price, which would be very much to your disadvantage as the person placing that large order. And that's the motivation for the large in scale waiver that's part of MiFID. It's also the motivation for people to place orders in dark pools. So if you have a massive order, if you process it through a dark pool, you can manage that over the course of a whole day or even days. Whereas if you're actually obliged to put it straight into a lit situation, everyone else in the market would be able to adjust their thinking immediately. So, in terms of equity markets, these have been transparent for a long time. I mean, well before MiFID. Having lit markets in equities, that's ground that's been broken before. It will be complicated by some of the changes, like the double volume cap restriction in terms of dark pools, the way in which the systematic internalizer regime has been adjusted. So it's not that it's going to be plain sailing in equities, but people have been there before. You know, it's a recalibration process. I don't think it's it'll cost money, but it shouldn't have. The knock-on effect should be more limited. In fixed income, that's a completely different situation. Or in terms of any other market, in fact, it's a pretty much a different situation. So that's where there isn't a great deal of prior experience to go on to understand how impactful the implementation of transparency will be. So there will be a lot of money spent. I mean, sorry, it was at the top of the slide. I mean, you know, that qualifies as a lot of money in my books, just to get market participants ready for the new transparency regime. But it's not just about getting ready, spending money on systems. It's also how actually operating in a lit environment will impact upon market participants. And whilst having more transparency sounds very enlightened, the past experience of transparency in markets is actually quite mixed. I can find you studies which show it's increased volumes, reduced volumes, increased transaction costs, lower transaction costs. If there is a common theme, it's around how liquid the instruments are that are being traded. So how readily market participants are willing to do business at any given price. That's what liquidity is about. The thing about MiFID and MiFID II is that they defined boundary, or MiFID II requires ESMA to define the boundary of what is liquid on one side and what is not liquid on the other. So where that boundary is going to matter a lot. And I think, so where that boundaries will matter a lot. I think there's certainly a worry that where ESMA are setting that boundary is actually not in the right place. So as and when MiFID II was implemented, I think to be liquid, a bond needs to be, I mean, there are a few dimensions, but I mean, a bond would need to be traded at least 15 times a day, whereas an equity would have to be traded 200 times a day. And that 15 times a day that requirement will shrink year by year until it's twice a day. And twice a day, in my view, isn't consistent with a particularly liquid market. So I think there is scope for basically a situation of false positives or false negatives, I'm not quite sure which now, where basically an instrument will be classified as liquid according to the law, but it won't be liquid in a real world sense. Those, I think, could be those instruments or instruments falling into that category could be quite severely impacted by the implementation of transparency rules. And that might mean that volumes will drop off in those instruments, and that might mean that the cost of capital will go up for the issuers of those instruments, and that will mean that the desire to promote capital markets will actually be impaired for at least some firms. So that's transparency. Transaction reporting, this is high cost too, but transaction reporting, it's essential, I think, for supervisors such as Martin and his peers to do their job properly. Yeah, so transaction reporting is critical both to help with the detection of market abuse, but also in terms of the promotion of confidence in the market integrity. So to achieve those things, you do need to have quite a lot of data reported. I think, 65 fields. That's up from the previous minimum of 24 fields, but it's also down from how some countries implemented MiFID I. So I think I'm right in saying in Germany, BaFin previously required 85 fields in its transaction reports. So in a way, that's actually coming down. But even so, there's a lot of novelty in the fields that are going to have to be filled in. There's more precision required, or a great deal of precision required in some of the fields, particularly in terms of time stamping. The upshot of all that is that it's going to be very expensive to do. But as I say, because of the nature of transaction reports, and because you've also got post-trade trade reports, the actual market consequences of transaction reporting should be pretty limited. In terms you wouldn't expect volumes to change significantly because of transaction reporting. So the sum of those and some of the other aspects of MiFID II that I haven't, of the market infrastructure aspects of MiFID II, but I haven't sort of touched upon specifically, it adds up to well over $1 billion in one-off costs, a few hundred million in ongoing costs. The banks can, I guess, afford it. Next, the costs of protecting investors. Again, I'm just going to pick on 2 or 3 aspects of this. I know it's a much bigger topic. The cost is broadly, it's not hugely dissimilar, maybe a little bit more towards the ongoing cost rather than the one-off cost. Okay, first topic, best execution. So in old MiFID, you had to take reasonable steps to ensure best execution, and it only applied to equities, I think. Now, it's a much broader requirement in terms of the assets covered, and you have to take sufficient steps. And that's a much stricter requirement, or in my understanding, it's a much stricter requirement. And firms may need to spend money consolidating feeds from various different platforms, trying to automate order routing. There's a lot of expenditure implied by having sufficient best execution. On the other hand, for investors, there's a lot of potential upside from best execution. If you look at the sort of execution of trades, there's massive variation depending on which venues you go to. So there's a lot of scope for enhancement by the sell side, by the industry, to improve the value obtained by investors. Yeah, and just in terms of keeping those costs down, there is some thinking that if a firm is covered by Dodd-Frank, some of its investment in the States will actually keep its costs down in Europe. We will see. The next aspect I want to touch upon, again, this is to help combat market abuse. MiFID II demands substantial broadening of communications monitoring. I mean, the old framework was, certainly outside of the UK at least, was very much oriented towards fixed line phones. So MiFID II is trying to keep pace with the way in which the markets have evolved subsequently, or just in terms of communications technology has evolved subsequently. So I think that's broadly speaking a good thing, but clearly it's going to have a significant cost attached. The way in which the rules, the retention rules have been written aren't very helpful. They talk, it's like 5 years, but maybe another couple of years, depending. If you see the contracts with the suppliers for these rules, just see how much, what happens if 5 years becomes 7 years, because often the costing will be based upon a certain retention period. And then if there's a surprise, as okay, well actually it's going to be another couple of years, suddenly they look, all bets are off in terms of how much you're charged for that. Yeah, so in terms of inducements, I mean, if we go back to the starting point with MiFID II, one of the original concepts was to basically follow a policy initiative that had been enacted in the UK, or was planned in the UK and the Netherlands, to do away with third-party commissions. So say if you're buying a packaged investment product from an intermediary, that intermediary might be incentivized by a commission receivable from the product provider. That didn't make it through to the final draft. It's only, if you want to call yourself independent, then this situation more or less applies. You certainly can't keep any such third-party commissions. I think this is a pity, and it's something I would like to see rectified as and when there is a MiFID III or a MiFID IV, whatever. We looked at the RDR initiative, which is the UK's version of this, and we found evidence of product bias in that market driven by these third-party commissions. So investors are suffering some detriment from this. So I think the fact that it hasn't, that system has been retained is a shame. Another way in which, again, it comes back to inducements actually, that's going to have a market consequence is that sell-side research is not going to be eliminated, but it's certainly going to have to justify itself a little bit more harder than it has before. What will that mean in the real world? I mean, well, hopefully transaction costs will come down since research will no longer be embedded in it. Got to expect there to be some increase in research by the buy side, research by independent research houses, maybe more research by corporate funded researchers, which is a phenomena, or a new phenomena. In the worst case, it could again shift the boundary between how big you need to be to make it make sense to be a listed firm, and if that boundary is, if that threshold is increased, again, that goes against some of the sort of purposes of MiFID II and the Capital Markets Union, which is to promote the use of capital markets by smaller firms. So I would say that is an unintended consequence. So overall, yeah, big numbers. In terms of who's paying the bills, The people who will be writing most of the checks directly will be investment banks. And their costs will be going up and potentially their revenues will be going down. But lots of other firms are also affected, so trading venues, other banks. Ultimately, there's the concern that even if an investment bank is writing a check, those costs may end up being passed through to the ultimate users of financial services, like non-financial companies and retail investors. Let's see. Yeah, so talk about this. I mean, MiFID II, it's going to partially level the. It's going to go a long way towards eliminating the scope for regulatory arbitrage in Europe. That's a good thing, or at least certainly pre-Brexit. That's definitely a good thing. By imposing more systems costs on market participants, it's probably raising or increasing barriers to entry in terms of being a capital market business. That's probably more. It's going to favour more larger firms against smaller firms. That's probably not a good thing. It also, I say, there's less regulatory differentiation within Europe, but certainly in some of the areas, MiFID II creates quite significant discrepancies between how capital markets will work in Europe and how they'll work in the rest of the world. So in terms of fixed income trading, for instance, that will be quite different between how it works in Europe and how it works in the States. One possible consequence of that is that some trade will migrate in one direction or another. I mean, I think the suspicion is that it will migrate from Europe to the States, but it's not guaranteed. So in terms of final thoughts, I mean, these are really more final questions. The EC, it's not just MiFID II, there has been a lot of regulation, obviously, of the financial services sector subsequent to the financial crisis. That's completely understandable. At some point, the Commission, the European Union, has promised to take a step back and have a look at the impact of all this regulation in the round. I think that process has started, but I wonder when it will be finished, and I wonder what the political context will be when the conclusions are drawn from that exercise. Because I think it will take into account upcoming Brexit, and that may mean that, that may not work out quite so well, because in the past, the European entities have often have looked quite closely at how things have happened in the UK and in the US. I think there's now scope for them to maybe have us take a sort of slightly more insular approach, and I think that could have. I think that runs a risk of worse outcomes. So that's over to you for questions.
Are there any questions?